he may have done, which he didn't have any control over. But it just goes to show how honorable a person he is. And so, in addition to his leadership abilities, he also has all of the powers and weaknesses of a vampire. We're also introduced to Mary Curie, and after years of experimenting with lethal radioactive materials, Mary Curie has developed a secondary persona. When she gets angry, she becomes extremely aggressive. She still has her general faculties about her, but it is difficult for her to control her rage. And we see it in the Zero issue on a couple of the pages which are colored, where there is a change in her skin tone, and we can see an actual physical change when she becomes Ms. Hyde. So it's a really neat twist on the Jekyll and Hyde story here. I'd say a parallel with Bruce Banner and the Incredible Hulk, where you've got a brilliant scientist who is engaged in these experiments and something goes wrong, and now the scientist has to deal with the mental and physical consequences of their experiment or experiments. And early on, we see that Madame Curie has been roped in by the alien conspiracy, but she is swayed to the side of the angels by none other than Sherlock Holmes. And in the world of the Victorian Four, Sherlock Holmes actually died in his confrontation with Professor Moriarty at Reichenbach Falls. Unlike the Arthur Conan Doyle stories, which explain that Holmes survived the fall and lay low for a couple of years before returning to life at 221B Baker Street, in this story, Holmes actually did die, but someone or some group resurrected him. His body was damaged beyond repair. However, his brain has been transplanted into the body of Frankenstein's monster. And what's really interesting is that while the monster retains its green skin complexion, there's been some significant plastic surgery performed on the monster so that its hair and facial features resemble those of Holmes. And it's Holmes who is able to reach out to Mary Curie and make her realize that she is on the wrong side and that she should come with him and his colleagues in the Victorian Four. Now, while Holmes appears to be in complete control of the monster's body, to the point where the monster's body, at the very least, mimics Holmes' traditional mannerisms, Holmes is terrified to learn that his mind is not the only one inside the monster's body. Evidently, Professor Moriarty's mind was also preserved and is inside the monster's body too, and is about to engage with Holmes in yet another battle of the minds, this time for control over the driver's seat for the monster's body. And then rounding out the team is John Henry, the hero from folktales. He is the hammer-wielding man who competed against a steam-powered hammer to show that human labor still was better than a machine. And so far, what we can see is that John Henry appears to be fully human. We may get more at this point, but given what I've told you about the three other members of the Victorian Four, I think maybe it's a good idea that one member of the team be fully human at this point. We're introduced to other characters over the first three issues. John Wilkes Booth, Lincoln's assassin, has been resurrected, but he has been resurrected as a werewolf, and he is bound and determined to assassinate President Lincoln once more. He is able to shift between his human and wolf forms very quickly, He certainly appears to be very powerful. We're also introduced to Benjamin Franklin, who, of course, resumes his friendship with Abraham Lincoln. And at this point, the only part of Franklin's body that is still human is his head. His head now rests upon a clockwork body. And I get the sense that, while Mr. Franklin may not be a field agent, I think he certainly has had some part in bringing the Victorian Four together. We're also introduced to Nikola Tesla, and he's a character who I hope we see come back in future issues, because this is the sort of team that doesn't need a doctor in the traditional sense. They need a doctor who also has a very keen understanding of science and technology, or steam-powered technology, given the time period which this story takes place in. He does come to the Victorians' aid at one point, and I hope that we see him in future issues of the series. We also get to see General Custer, who is now a gun-toting, steam-powered cyborg. And we're also introduced to Van Helsing, who, not surprisingly, is going to have his very personal reasons for wanting to take down members of both the conspiracy and the Victorian Four. And I'm thinking that he's got big bullseyes planned for both Booth and Lincoln. So there's the general premise behind the Victorian Four. A group of resurrected heroes who are taking on an alien conspiracy. Now, as to why you should buy this book. First off, looking at the story end of things, I really love the pacing that Sam has provided for this book. Each issue is very satisfying on its own, and I really like how it's not decompressed, but it's not compressed either. And I really like how there's an even balance of character development and straight up action, and it moves very nicely between the character development, introspection, and then the action. So there's never like a long lull. You never get bored at points. Certainly at the parts where you're learning more about the characters and their background, how they came to be, how they are now, that's all really very interesting. And then when it gets into the action sequences, it's very quick paced. And you get invested in these characters as well, and you get the sense that none of these characters are completely invincible. None of them are completely safe. And I even wonder if this is a sort of lineup which could change over time, given that Sam is using a mix of real-life characters, real-world characters, and literary characters. Just like the Justice Society of America may change its lineup here and there at different points, so too might that happen with the Victorian Four. I really like how Sam is developing the relationships between the different characters. It feels very realistic, like seeing the interaction between Lincoln and Franklin, seeing the back and forth between Lincoln and Booth. You can really feel the hatred that Booth has for Lincoln. It goes beyond the fact that Booth is now a werewolf who also has this lust for flesh. But what's really capturing my interest right now is the relationship between Mary Curie and Sherlock Holmes. And certainly on a surface level, it makes sense that you have these two brilliant minds who are going to connect on an intellectual level. But at the same time, I like that there's this personal connection now, and that it was Holmes who reached out to Madame Curie and helped bring her back into the light. And she appreciates that greatly. And I like how Sam's setting up that we're not going to see, a hokey romance between the two characters. In the Sherlock Holmes stories, Holmes was attracted to Irene Adler on a deep emotional level, and then after he saw that he couldn't have her, he just moved on and said, well, that's it, I'm done pursuing a relationship. So I can see here these two, they aren't going to have that romantic or physical relationship, but certainly there's going to be that closeness between the two of them. And they can certainly relate in that Holmes is literally inside the body of a monster, whereas Curie finds that if she's not able to control her emotions, her mind will also become trapped in the body of a monster. Something else that really has me intrigued is the ongoing battle of the minds within the monster's body between Holmes and Moriarty. And I didn't ask Sam this before recording this episode because, I didn't want to accidentally spoil anything, and I know that Sam listens to this show, so Sam, I'm going to throw out this question to you here now, but something I'm going to throw out to you when we meet in person. The question is, in this story, is Professor Moriarty a real character? Like, was there a real Moriarty who fell to his death alongside Holmes at Reichenbach Falls? Or is Moriarty simply a figment of Holmes's imagination? And so I need to explain this a little bit and step into the world of Sherlock Holmes, because in addition to being a comics fan, I'm also a really big Sherlock Holmes fan. And so for those of you who don't know as much about Sherlock Holmes, it may interest you to know that after only a couple of years of writing Sherlock Holmes stories, Arthur Conan Doyle was sick of writing Sherlock Holmes. He felt that Holmes's stories were keeping Doyle from moving on to other projects. And so Doyle went to the Strand, who published the Sherlock Holmes stories, and said, that's it, I'm done, I want to kill off Holmes. And the people at the Strand said, yeah, well, it's been a good 2-year run, go ahead. And so Doyle wrote the story, The Adventure of the Final Problem, in which Holmes went to his friend and partner, Dr. Watson, and said, I've encountered the greatest evil that has ever fallen upon this earth. He is Professor Moriarty, and I need to track him down, and I need to stop him no matter what the cost. And so Holmes takes Watson on a whirlwind trip across the continent that ends up with them being in Switzerland. They get separated at one point. Watson is finally able to get back on the trail. He goes to Reichenbach Falls, where he sees at the top of the cliff 2 sets of footprints, signs of a physical struggle. And Watson fears the worst, and so he goes back down. He goes to the base of the cliff, and he finds a letter from his dear friend Holmes, which says, my friend, if you're reading this, it means that I've died. No doubt Moriarty and I grasped each other at the top of the cliff and have fallen to our deaths, and our bodies will have been washed away. Thank you for your friendship, Holmes. So Professor Moriarty was never meant to be this great ongoing character. Moriarty was simply a device that Doyle came up with to present a credible justification for Holmes meeting his death. None of the other antagonists that Holmes faced off against presented a true threat to Holmes's well-being.